Isaac Martinez. Do we call you the webinar whisperer?
I've never been referred to that, but I've had someone call me a webinar guru before.
Guru. Well, the sales whisperer is calling you a webinar whisperer. Okay. So you take that and run with it. Okay, man. Well, welcome to the sales podcast. How the heck are you?
Doing good. Fair enough. I appreciate you having me on.
Webinar. So, dude, are you going to talk about like faxing next? Are we going back to pagers, like webinars? Really? Come on, man. I was told webinars were dead.
Yeah, it's further than the truth. The pandemic really put webinars on kind of supercharge. And as people were getting into webinars, they really thought it was a lot of art, and webinars is purely science. I mean, there's an exact formula that you need to follow when you enter into the space and start leveraging webinars for sales.
Nice. I tell people that all the time about selling. It's like selling is a lot more predictable. Oh, you get the gift of gab, you should be in sales. No, no.
That's exactly how kind of the webinar space is. It's not about saying, hey, I can put together a great presentation. Here's an audience, let's go. There's so many different phases to a webinar to pull off a great webinar. And I often tell people that I get involved with, and anybody that has experience in doing webinars, there's really only two types of webinars. There's great webinars, and then there's terrible webinars. And there's there's really nothing in between.
How did you get into webinar marketing?
So I went through about 15 plus years ago, the transition of going from selling in person, running conferences, the road shows, doing everything from trade shows to infomercials and everything you can think of selling in person. And it kind of just as the technology evolved and our business evolved and funnels evolved, we just couldn't. The cost of marketing just made those traditional processes kind of cost prohibitive for us. And so as we evolved through the process, we started experimenting using webinars to drive sales. And I tell you what, the first several years, it was atrocious for us to try to figure out, like, what are we doing? We knew we had to make a change. I knew we had to do something differently, but there's so many things that just wasn't there that's there today as far as getting into the webinar. So over the past 15 years, it was about building technology around our webinar sales process to remove friction that is there inside of when you're trying to use webinars to sell. And then it's kind of breaking down the webinars to the science of it, where it's kind of recognizing there's 4 phases of a webinar. There's the marketing, there's presenting, then you get into selling and closing, and all that has to be supported through technology, and you got to understand your data around the technology. So over the last 15 years, I've kind of probably done over $300 million in sales, leveraging webinars. And it's been all about how do we make the sales funnel using webinars just more efficient.
So when you say in the beginning was atrocious, are you saying like you weren't good on the webinar, or the technology to do it was bad, or both?
I would say all the above. 15 years ago, I was kind of an early pioneer in the webinar space. So really trying to figure out, how do you connect with the user and the prospect or the client, depending on who you're trying to sell with. It was a challenge. And think about 15 years ago, the trust in selling online wasn't there that's there today. So part of it was figuring out, how do you connect to the user? How do you build the appropriate call to actions? What's the right length of time for the webinar? What's the right time of day? The day of the webinar, what day of the week gets the best webinar? So there's all these little things that you have to figure out. And then when you kind of start to apply tech of how you make it more efficient, I found myself dealing with, we were going out marketing, getting 500 people to register for a webinar, but we were only getting 70 people to show up. right? And that's like to this day, that's a core problem that majority of companies are dealing with. All right, they die right out of the get-go, or they struggle because like, well, we're getting all these leads, we have this list, but we just can't get people to show up to the webinars.
Yeah, I know, like, especially now with technology that lets me fast forward, I don't want to sit on a webinar. uh, most of the time it seems like they show up late and then there's some kind of glitch. And then it's, hey, we're going to give it a few minutes so everybody can, hey, put in the chat where you're calling in from. Hey, Joe from Miami. Hey, Wes from California. I'm like, dude, really? Then they want to show me about their family. Here's my mission. Here's my why.
Yeah, I think so many people get that wrong in presenting, right? That people don't care about who you are. People don't care about your family. They care about those things if you develop a relationship. What they care about is what's the value you're providing to them? How are you going to make a difference? And that's where it's kind of like you hit the nail on the head in that scenario. That's the difference of somebody that's trying to do webinars versus going with a professional company where they have the right intervals and the cadence of when do they kind of invite you, how do they intro you, what do they in the presenting, when they're in the presenting phase of the webinar. A presenter can make and break a webinar, and most companies fail with taking their subject matter expert, making them a presenter, which isn't engaging. They don't have the energy level. They're very boring. Presenters make all the difference, and having the right presenter from the very start makes the difference. And then also understanding, regardless of when your webinar is and your start time, your length, the average person's only going to give you about 45 minutes of the time. If you have a 2-hour webinar, it doesn't matter. They're going to give you 45 minutes. If they join 15 minutes early because you haven't optimized your reminder send, guess what? You lost 15 minutes sitting into a dead room of their attention. And these days, everybody's fighting for your attention. You know, on your phone, your computers, Slack, your kids, your wife, everyone's fighting for your attention. So your webinar is about, you got to optimize that thing and make sure you're delivering the most amount of value to that customer in the shortest period of time to build a level of trust with them, so they don't fall into like kind of what you said is where, hey, I don't want to sit in a webinar. And even worse, people are looking, can tell the difference of a live webinar from a recorded webinar, and those have different performances in themselves as well.
Yeah. Where do webinars work or not work, right? You've got the enterprise sale, but I mean, a CEO of a Fortune 1000 company probably isn't going to attend a webinar, right? Maybe one of their third level VPs might, in an SMB space, maybe the founder of a 50 or 100 person company might be on a webinar, but then you've got like small businesses, 5, 10, 15 employees. So the owner is knee deep in the business. Like, are there different strategies to reach those different people, or is it kind of like golf? Just grab the club, put the same swing, and you'll get the good results.
No, it's about segmentation, right? Really knowing your audience, knowing your product that you're selling makes the whole difference. And then kind of understanding if you're doing, say, enterprise sales, traditionally you're doing a one-to-one type of webinar where you are, say, Salesforce's sales cycle. What they do is they're running a one-to-one product demonstration, right? They're running you through the application. They're talking about their value. It's generally about an hour long. And then you have the one-to-many or group webinars, right? Where you're doing one company and you're broadcasting to 100, 200, 500,000 people at a time. It's really less about the size of the company and more about the product offering that you're selling to. I would say group webinars or one-to-many webinars are generally speaking more of a B2C format, And then a one-to-one webinars are more of a, or one-to-few is more of a B2B. However, most companies, and even the Salesforce of the world, all the enterprise Fortune 500 companies that run a traditional one-to-one enterprise sales cycle, very similar to how we do it, you supplement that with the one-to-many, back to the one-to-many webinars, where you're doing one-to-one, but you bring on, when a company or Fortune 500 company wants to bring on a group webinar, they're generally bringing on a topic where they're providing value to their prospects, and they're leading with that, and that one-to-many webinars, again, a lead on to get to the breakouts, to get to the product demos on the one-to-one basis. So it's a mix and match, but yeah, you're generally right on the big companies. It's a little more personable, but they're still using a webinar format to sell. When you get into, say, $100 million and down, it's and in a B2C format, it's heavily driven by group webinars.
So it's interesting you're calling a one-to-one a webinar. How do you treat it differently?
Yeah, I would think so. So whether you're calling it a webinar or calling it a meeting, you're generally speaking using the same technology
Right.
that you're delivering to. So I kind of bucket it all into the same and don't really delineate, call it a webinar from a meeting format. What you get to do on a one-to-one webinar that you don't in a group webinars is the presentations generally should be more tailored to the solution you're providing to the company that you're speaking to. Versus in a group webinar, you're more generic, you're higher level, delivering the value and the concept. So the approach is a bit differently.
In the one-to-many space, what's working today, even to get people to register? We can talk about getting them to attend next, but like what works? Email, or they register from a cold, an ad in the LinkedIn news feed, like what's working today?
So there's two types of cohorts of customers that are driving to the one-to-many webinars. There is the traditional way where you are driving your LinkedIn advertisement, your social media, your pay-per-click, your organic. You're driving traditional advertising to a landing page explaining what your compelling offer is or why to sign up a webinar. That method has about a 20% show rate, 30%, a little more than 30% if you're doing things great in that method. However, the actual people that attend your webinar, if you're looking at the mix, the biggest group of people that most companies overlook and they don't know how to penetrate is their list. So what do they do for every 100 people they get as new leads through marketing? 20 of them show up for a webinar. There's 80 people roll into your list, and that just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And that's probably the single biggest challenge that companies struggle with today from the marketing side, is how to convert your list, both people who have never attended your webinar and new people or repeat webinar attendees into a webinar again or for the very first time. And some of that comes to they're just using old tactics that have proven to be really painful friction spots. And I'll give you an example of that. You've probably gotten an email from a company you've engaged with some compelling offer that says, hey, we have a webinar starting in 5 days. And you click through the register link and it takes you to a landing page that tells you more about the webinar and then another landing form, right? Have you ever experienced that?
Sure.
And so when you go through there, the average person is kind of fatigued and it's a friction spot. They've already clicked on the email. They've already gone to the landing page and they opt out, right? You've already lost their attention. And for every 100 people that are on clicking, you're maybe getting 15% are actually filling out the form. However, 100 people just said, I'm interested. And so that tactic is very inefficient right now in the market space, and there's a better way. And so the better way of what you do is a company creates their compelling offer, they email the customer, and when they say, hey, register now, I believe the click is the action. So this is kind of one of the secret things that we do. When you click register now in the email, the click is the action. We, with inside of 1 second, instantly will register you. And so your next confirmation page is not another form, but now it's confirming, hey, what just happened? We registered you as you kind of opted into on the click. And now we're priming you on that bump page of what we want you to start to do, or whatever we need to prime you or induce you to do before a webinar, whether it's to put it on your calendar. It may be a video talking about what's going to come next. It may be an ebook. It may sign up for your trial. There's a bunch of different things where you get to basically serve up a click earlier, which makes a big difference to the prospects. And then 100% of your clicks that people intended to register become registration. So it's just a slight change in tactics, but makes a significant difference in how you can maximize the value of your lead list that most companies don't do today.
So you're saying ads to cold traffic gets, I mean, you were saying what, 20 to 30%. I mean, that seems decent, right? I mean, is that okay?
Yeah, but that's standard. Like literally, that's just what it is. And there's a few ways you can remind it to people to optimize it, but the big gem that people overlook or just struggle with is their lead list, the list that they've built over time, that they've already sunk tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Are you saying they're not marketing to them? Like they're not inviting them to the next webinar? They just keep going out for cold traffic?
You always want to do both, but what the average company is marketing to their lead list very inefficiently. And so what's leading them to get, say, 20% open rates in their emails that they're sending out, 5% click-through rates, and 1% registration rates. So it's a horribly inefficient way. And really, in this day and age of technology, like, you don't need to ask somebody to register. The click is the action. If they're clicking on your email that says register now, they want to get registered. And so the most companies, enterprise companies and small business, get that wrong at all levels, and they just don't understand there's a more efficient way.
So people, they don't get irritated, because I mean, sometimes it's like, well, let me click and learn more. Do you say one click registration?
Yeah, I think you want to be clear in the email, right? You don't want to have black hat tactics. I think it's all about building the right expectations. It's about making sure in your marketing tactics that you are clear with what's going to happen. Click here to register now, right? You're telling them when you click here, they're going to register now. Versus, hey, click here for more information. So, and you can dynamically have, depending on the CTA they're clicking on, to have a different experience of what they're doing.
Yeah. But I mean, heck, the mere fact that they are on your list and getting the email, I mean, they're already, they haven't opted out, right? So they want to hear from you. So yeah, I mean, they shouldn't be too irritated.
No, I can tell you from doing this for as many years as I have, it is not the method kind of that I described as, it's not a black hat tactic. It's not something that disrupts and upsets customers. And you're not forcing somebody. A registration isn't a mandatory obligation for somebody to attend. It's about providing providing convenience for them. It's about making a frictionless, or making it have less friction in the process of getting them to register, because the name of the game in marketing, whether it's sales or otherwise, right, it's touch points. You got to be able to touch them at the right time. And so it's like anything else in sales, right? Time kills all deals. Same concept applies with on the marketing phase of a webinar, right? You got to make it as convenient as possible, as frictionless as possible to get somebody into that webinar.
So in a one-to-many B2B setting, what is typically the purpose of that webinar? Is it to drive, like to push for an appointment, a one-on-one demo, or are you actually making sales on that webinar?
I've seen it all the above, right? And so it really depends on a company's sales cycle and what they're trying to do to make sure their a webinar without a clear purpose to how it's progressing a prospect or customer down a funnel is a pointless webinar. It's a make you feel good webinar. So every webinar needs to be driven to support your funnel. As an example, I've seen companies that the purpose of their webinars purely to deliver value. But part of their delivering value is they have a soft CTA, or their call to action is to, hey, to continue the conversation, click here, or, if you want to learn more, sign up for a demo. And generally webinars that are leading with value are more so with soft CTAs are generally driving to a one-on-one demo where they can customize the experience for you and more of that enterprise sales cycle. I've also seen the other side where the sales process is about getting a prospect to make a micro purchase, a purchase under $100. And because that's the next step in their sales cycle. So they're going to deliver, signing up for somebody for whether it's a book, a cheap consulting period of time, it's whatever that next lead magnet thing is for them. Or you're driving somebody to a trial or a freemium where you want them to self-service. Like if you are, say, MailChimp, MailChimp will post webinars. It's about teaching you their platform, and their whole goal is to get you to drive engagement on a trial on their platform. So because they know that if they can get you to engage, they're going to get you to buy. So, and then you have the other side where people are actually, they're there to sell. They're going to turn around and based off of the data they know on you and who they know and how many times you've seen a webinar, where you're in the cycle, that webinar may be completely geared around getting you to opt into either click into an e-com purchase, a link they're going to deliver in the webinar, or supported by, hey, identify yourself through a CTA to become a buyer, and then we're going to get on the phone with you and try to sell you. So I've seen from the technology space, I've got and having a database or a platform with lots of data, I get to see it all. And so I've seen all extremes of what customers are doing. And my recommendation is the webinar needs to support your sales cycle to progress somebody through the funnel.
Is there a best practice though? Like, if you're selling $10,000 or $50,000 consulting, are they going to buy that on a webinar? Or if you're selling, I sell software, HubSpot, Keep, could be, they have freemium offers. They have, you may have to jump right in. Some are month to month, some are annual contract. I mean, I can't see somebody buying HubSpot from a webinar, but maybe they could say, all right, HubSpot is the right tool for me. Let's talk.
Yeah, there's a blend on a direct purchase, like is more of a B2C, right? Where you're demonstrating something and you want to get that person to buy whatever you're delivering. And it could be driven by an e-com, like that emotional instant responsive purchase is generally geared towards the B2C customer. On the B2B, it's about continuing to that next conversation, right? A webinar, most people make the mistakes when they're presenting a webinar to only look at their audience through a single interaction. And through data, there's two types of buyers in a webinar. There's people that identify themselves and say, hey, I'm interested in buying, right? I'm responding to your CTA. I'm saying, call me right now. And that may not be, hey, I'm buying right now, but you're going to take the next step in the conversation to keep going down your sales funnel. But then you have behavior buyers. And this is an area that so many companies just don't understand the data behind their audience because the indication of somebody's going to buy is two things. One, they identify themselves. Those are the easy guys to find. But the second group of people are the behavior buyers. And those are people that their behaviors mirror what your purchasers are doing, but they're not identifying themselves yet. So you're looking and you need to aggregate what are they doing over time, right? And it's generally not a single webinar. It's 2-3 webinars. From the data I've seen, most people need to see at least like 2.3 webinars, 2.5 webinars before they're kind of hit that buyer profile or become that hot opportunity through a behavior. But it's really tracking those data points and understanding what are the data points to find the behavior buyers, so you can kind of communicate to them differently. Because when a webinar ends and you're going to go from presenting to selling, a lot of companies struggle with that transition to this day. And I can't tell you, enterprise companies, Fortune 500 companies, some of them even are still using stupid spreadsheets to call. But you need to understand that the audience that you just pitched to is not all the same. And you want to really prioritize and say, hey, I want to call the hot opportunities, the people that have identified themselves first. Then I want to call the behavior buyers second. Then I want to call the people that have attended over 30 minutes third. And then I want to call the people that saw my CTA fourth. And then, maybe everyone else you shouldn't be calling through the data, and you should be remarketing to them because they're not warm enough yet to make a phone call. And so that is it's such a key part to really maximizing the value of your experience when you're putting on a webinar.
Yeah. So, things have come a long way in the last 15 years. Are people still getting it wrong? Is off-the-shelf stuff good enough?
I would say the average company absolutely gets it wrong. And they just don't know. So if we were to take where the mass majority of webinars happen from for a company that has doing about $500,000 to $50 million, maybe $100 million a year in sales, is where the largest group of people that are putting on webinars to one-to-many and one-to-one style of webinars. And some of those 20% of them have figured it out, and they have a way. They still understand that it's inefficient, but they have a way that they're making it work. 80% of them are kind of on the verge of either not having it work or they're just treading water. And so I would say the majority of people that I see that are in the webinar space are just outright struggling, and because they haven't been able to crack the science of webinars. They don't understand. They haven't looked at, say, hey, the marketing phase, how do we remove these friction points? In the presenting phase, what are the optimal ways to present, the CTAs, length of time, all of those things. How do we go to selling, and then how do we use data to drive sales? And so when you start to break it down, it's unfortunate, but a lot of companies struggle with that.
Yeah. People are working from home, they're still the remote, but some are going back to the office. Does that matter? Are people, do you see them attending more or paying more attention if they're working from home versus in the office? Or is that just not even playing into it?
I don't think it really plays into it. Maybe you have a small downtick at the stay-at-home environment because people are traditionally working a little bit less. They don't have somebody, big brother, looking over their shoulder. I know from talking to people that are interviewing and different things, they see a little bit less of a participation and engagement in certain areas. But overall, all in all, I think more people in the last 2 years have made the leap that otherwise have kind of fought the wave of transitioning and learning how to sell through webinars. There's more people today leveraging webinars to sell and demonstrate their product than there was 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 5 years ago. That audience is even bigger. And the positive side of that, it means the more companies that are putting customers down the using webinars and down a webinar funnel, the more the end users conditioned to be sold that way.
You know, you talk about the 45 minutes. Have you tested, or is it okay maybe to do like 3 or 4 15-minute webinars with some Q&A, you know, over the course of maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or just get it done?
I have seen that and have experimented with all of those personally myself, right? I have probably done about 10,000 webinars, not all of them directly, but my companies have done about 10,000 webinars. So we've done short ones, we've done long ones. And so the short answer depends on your price point. If you're selling a $100 or less product, you don't need anything longer than 30 minutes most of the time. If you're trying to get somebody to a free trial, and it's really cut and dry, you may not need a long one. But the most ideal webinar length is somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes, I've found. And it really comes down to your price point. Understanding though that regardless of your length of time, the customer's going to generally attend more than once. And they need to attend more than once because they want to hear the message twice. They want to do their own research after they get off the phone or get off a webinar with you. Life is going to happen and to be distracted. There's very few people that watch one webinar and make that buying decision right then and there and say, hey, I'm ready to go. It's a touch point along the way, but most people need, 2.5 times. But the driver of the 2 to 2.5 times is less about the number of times and it's more about their duration, because one of the key indicators of whether somebody's entering that buy zone is their total duration through multiple webinars. So as an example is generally for the average customer, when their total duration equals or greater than 100% of your webinar length of time, they start to enter into that buy zone. Very few people do that in the very first webinar they attend. Most people are doing that over 2 to 3 webinars because they're only giving you 30 to 40 minutes. So they get a part of it and they may have missed, like you kind of started at the beginning of the show here, you were saying some people join late, some people join on time, some people join too early. And so a lot of people may miss the front of a webinar, but they got the end and the closing and the call to action. Some people get the front, but they bail before they get to the call to action. Some people just join and they leave right in the center, and others leave right before it even starts. And so the truest indication of when somebody's gonna buy is less about the number of webinars and it's more about the total duration over time.
So do you recommend doing, maybe having the same webinar? Hey, every Thursday, we're going to Thursday, 10 a.m., join this webinar on ABCs of selling.
Yeah, I would say having a consistent theme in your webinar, call it for 1 to 6 weeks, is generally pretty productive, right? Because so many people, it's going to be their first time. So many people are going to be their repeat time of seeing it. And believe it or not, that guy who attends or woman who attends the first time, they want to see the same thing the second time because they're there the second time to validate what they saw the first time. And so if you change your webinar too frequently, you are gonna make it too confusing for the end consumer. With that being said, you do want to change it up. You don't want to have the same webinar for 6 months. You want to slightly tweak it. But what should change almost every single time is your offer, and not your core offer as in, hey, you offer software or you're offering real estate or some training program but your compelling reason why to buy, right? Or why to take the next step. Hey, so creating urgency and the types of urgency you create, you should be constantly changing in that webinar. So, for those that are signing up now, we're going to give you, free X. If you're trying to get somebody to buy, your discount should be changing. If you're going to get someone on a trial, because that's your next step, you may be extending the trial or shortening the trial. So the close and the nature and the components of the close, you do want to change over time. The guts of the presentation, you want to be a little bit more careful to change that. And the other reason why you don't want to change that is because it takes so hard to create it's a lot of time to create a great presentation. And when you start to drift from a presentation that's working, you may be drifting into something that doesn't close as good and that doesn't have the same results or as other webinars. So overly adjusting your webinar and changing things up too frequently is a detriment to most companies.
Do you find that the Q&A is valuable? And if so, should it be saved to the end, or do you take questions as you go?
I generally think if you're going to have a Q&A process, it's towards the end of a webinar. It also can kind of anchor people in the webinar along the way. Say, hey, if you have any questions, we're going to open it up at the end to take your questions. So it gives a reason for that person to make it to the end. For those that are, and it's also an engagement point to where somebody's at the end asking questions. It's a great sign for a qualified buyer or opportunity in that person. Doing it inside of a webinar, on a group webinar setting, I find to be, and the data will show you, is very disruptive to the flow and of a presenter that's going. But on a one-to-one webinar, it's just the nature of the beast. They're going to happen that way. It's kind of virtually impossible on a one-to-one webinar to stop and just have somebody, on a one-to-one webinar, a person will feel like you're being dismissive of them if you don't allow them to interject and kind of ask questions along the way.
Right. You talk about like changing it up. I mean, in my world, I've been doing the Sales Whisperer for 17 years. And the core of what I do has never changed. Sales is sales, and there's fundamental things you have to get right. So like, how much does that presentation have to change?
As far as you're saying, as a webinar presentation,
right?
Consistency is the key in the presenting side of a webinar, and a great webinar from a sales perspective is a webinar that is building in, has the appropriate amount of call to actions, isn't cheesy, has lots of energy, and you're building in objections that the end salesperson that you're going to handle when you get off the phone. As many of those that you can naturally build into the webinar, that when you transition from presenting to selling, that those objections have been answered and addressed, and maybe not fully addressed, but the essence of what those objections are have been addressed in the presentation. It would make your job easier as the salesman, right? And,
Yep.
and the more you can focus on price, the more you can focus on getting the yes, versus trying to say, well, what time does this thing happen, or what guarantee do I have, or the 1,001 objections that people have. I generally recommend write your 10 most frequent objection that you're dealing with, and bake those into your presentation. Build them into it organically and naturally. So as you're demonstrating and going through your product, you're systematically touching on those objections. It makes a huge difference, because a webinar is there to support you as the salesperson. A webinar should make your job as the salesperson significantly easier, having somebody go through a webinar than having somebody not. But it also kind of as a company wide, when you have, because I've run, my former company, I had 40 people in my sales department. It allows the universal messaging of the company that's being delivered to everybody with the support of the salespeople, and it helps reduce, John, the salesperson, saying one thing, Billy saying another, and kind of letting the salespeople deviate too far from the message of the company.
Yeah, you want that consistent messaging.
Yeah, correct.
Cool. So you've got software. So it's narware.com. But you've got a redirect, right? Biggerwebinars.com. That'll take people to a landing page. And you got a little bonus there for us.
Yeah, so I have a 20-page ebook, the 10 Secrets to a Great Webinar. There's some of the best practices of how to build and put on a successful sales webinar, and tips and tricks that I've learned and incorporated into my company's webinars. It also, what we do is kind of Narware.com. What we do as a company is we cover all 4 phases of a sales webinar. We're kind of the ultimate webinar retargeting tool and process automation software. And it's kind of just a big fancy way of saying we're a middleware that sits between your webinar provider and your CRM that helps you get higher webinar attendance and bigger webinars and more sales from your webinar. And we do that through a variety of ways, but leveraging kind of my 15 years of experience built into technology. That's not a simple, hey, this is a reminder, but where we're using data on the customers and proven tactics to reduce the friction and then identify buyers that are attending your webinars.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I love one-to-many.
Yeah, when you get it right, it's rocket fuel to your organization. When you're kind of experimenting and you don't get it right, man, it's pain. It's this side distraction where the organization's like, hey, let's hurry up, let's get this thing going, or kill it, right? And you need to be able to nurture it, understand the science, understand the formulas, and then dump rocket fuel in your organization.
Do you offer replays? Man, people always ask, is this being recorded? But then I see they don't go access it anyway.
Yeah, I think every webinar you should record for a variety of reasons. I think one, you should record them for your own training
for
purposes.
Sure, record them for yourself, but like, do you give them to people?
I think you can make them available. I'm not a big fan of using recorded webinars and trying to pawn them off as live webinars. There's nothing like a live webinar and everyone's looking for this magical recorded webinar that just sells and pushes people through the funnel. And that's like trying to find Bigfoot. It just doesn't exist out there. There's 15 years, I don't really think I've heard of anybody having that evergreen webinar that's truly evergreen. But you can put it out there as far as post a webinar. Here's a link to watch it, but I think there's more effective ways to handle that customer's experience than telling them, here's a webinar, go watch and go look at it. I think there's a lot of different clever tactics you can do there, because it's about taking that guy and speaking to him, right? Or taking the person and speaking to him in that moment. You'd rather give him a one-on-one live webinar than have him go watch a replay. He's going to skip them.
Yeah. Yep. Cool, man. All right. Well, we are linking out. It's already here, biggerwebinars.com. Then they can get the report and then schedule a demo with you as well, right?
Perfect. Yep, absolutely.
Right there. All right. Well, you're linking out. Well, cool, man. It's Miller time for you. So out in Florida. So thanks for coming on the show, man. It's great catching up.
Likewise. Thank you, brother.
All right, man. Have a great day.